The night was thick with tension in Tehran. Streets were silent, but inside safe houses and embassies, men whispered of plans that would shake an entire nation. A democratically elected leader, admired by his people, was about to be targeted in a plot woven not by local rivals, but by some of the world's most powerful intelligence agencies. Cash had been moved, agents deployed, and propaganda machines cranked to full volume. The fate of Iran, and perhaps the balance of the Cold War itself, hung in the air. Yet what was unfolding would remain buried in secrecy for decades. A story denied, distorted, and finally revealed in fragments only much later. Before we crack open this file, let me ask you, where are you watching this from, and at what time? I always love knowing how far these stories reach. And if you're someone who thrives on uncovering the hidden battles of history, then hit that subscribe button to Spy Wars. Declassified. These files drop often, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Now, back to Tehran, 1953, a city on the edge of chaos, and a leader named Mohammad Mossadegh standing firm against the might of empires. Mossadegh had risen to power as the face of Iranian nationalism. An aristocrat by birth, but deeply respected for his incorruptible stance, he embodied the desire of Iranians to reclaim their sovereignty. The issue at the heart of it all was oil. For decades, the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company, later known as BP, had drained Iran's vast petroleum wealth, funneling profits to Britain while leaving Iranians with little more than scraps. Workers toiled under harsh conditions. The state received minimal royalties, and resentment seethed across the nation. By the late 1940s, this resentment had crystallized into a political demand: nationalize the oil industry. In 1951, Mossadegh made that demand a reality. Parliament passed his nationalization bill, and the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company was seized. For Iranians, it was a moment of triumph, a declaration that their resources would no longer be exploited by foreigners. Crowds poured into the streets to celebrate. Mossadegh was hailed as a hero, not just in Tehran, but across the wider Middle East, where other nations too were wrestling with colonial legacies and Western dominance. But in London, the move was seen as a direct assault on British power. The loss of Iranian oil revenues was a devastating blow, especially as Britain was still recovering from World War II. For Winston Churchill's government, Mossadegh was not a nationalist leader asserting his people's rights. He was a threat to Britain's survival. London immediately sought ways to topple him. Initially, the United States was reluctant. The Truman administration viewed Mossad sympathetically, recognizing that he had the legitimacy of his people's support. For a time, Washington even tried to mediate between London and Tehran. But the Cold War was tightening, and by the time Dwight Eisenhower entered the White House in 1953, the lens had shifted. Mossadegh's popularity, his independence from Western powers, and the growing strength of Iran's Communist Tudeh Party created alarm in Washington. CIA analysts began to warn that if Mossadegh was not checked, Iran might slip into the Soviet orbit. Whether or not Mossadegh had any real intention of allying with Moscow was almost irrelevant. The perception was enough. Key, and so Operation Ajax was born. A covert plan spearheaded by the CIA, with MI6 as its partner, and with whispers of intelligence sharing that some historians suggest may have involved Israeli contacts as well, though the extent remains debated. Its goal was simple: remove Mossadegh, reinstall the Shah as absolute ruler, and secure Western control over Iran's strategic position and its oil. The mechanics of the coup were both crude and sophisticated. CIA officer Kermit Roosevelt Jr., the grandson of former U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, was dispatched to Tehran to oversee the operation. He brought with him suitcases of cash, which would be used to bribe politicians, military officers, clerics, and journalists. Propaganda was unleashed in newspapers, painting Mossadegh as unstable, dictatorial, even secretly a communist sympathizer. Demonstrations were staged with hired mobs, some supporting Mossadegh, others opposing him, all designed to create the illusion of chaos. Mossadegh, for his part, knew he was under siege. He tried to maneuver between his rivals, appeal to the United Nations, and hold his coalition together. But the pressure was relentless. Britain had already imposed a worldwide embargo on Iranian oil, strangling the economy. Now, with CIA cash flooding the streets and MI6 coordination behind the scenes, the ground beneath him began to crack. The first attempt to oust him came in mid-August 1953 and seemed to falter. The Shah, terrified and indecisive, briefly fled the country. Mossadegh's supporters appeared to have the upper hand. But Roosevelt refused to give up. He redoubled efforts, pouring more money into Tehran, rallying the army, and orchestrating larger, bloodier demonstrations. Within days, the tide turned. On August 19, 1953, tanks and soldiers loyal to the coup stormed Tehran. Clashes erupted, and by evening, Mossadegh's house was surrounded and shelled. He surrendered, was arrested, and later put on trial. The Shah returned in triumph, backed by Washington and London. The coup had succeeded. But what looked like a victory in 1953 would echo with consequences far beyond the Cold War calculations of the day. Iranians never forgot that their democracy had been crushed, not by their own choice, but by foreign manipulation. The anger simmered for decades, shaping the revolution of 1979 and the bitter hostility that still defines relations between Tehran and Washington. And as for Mossadegh, he remained a symbol. A frail man in his 70s, humiliated but unbroken, he was sentenced to house arrest, where he spent the last years of his life. To many, he was the leader who dared to challenge empire only to be crushed by secret war. Yet the story of this coup is not just about one man. It is about the hidden machinery of intelligence, the way empires operate in shadows, and the price nations pay when their fate is determined by covert hands. The files remained classified for decades, denied by officials, whispered about in Iran, but treated as myth elsewhere. Only in the late 20th and early 21st centuries did declassified documents confirm what Iranians had long known. That operation, Ajax, was real, that the CIA and MI6 had orchestrated the fall of Mossadegh, and that the world had been reshaped in those tense August days. But here's the thing. This coup was never just a battle between East and West. It was also a story of betrayal within Iran. Of elites bought off, of clerics persuaded, of newspapers corrupted. It was a mirror of how fragile democracies can be when external powers exploit their internal divisions. And even today, scholars debate the exact role of every actor. Was Mossadegh doomed by Western intelligence, or by his inability to manage Iran's fractious politics? Did the coup succeed because of CIA planning, or because of the ambitions of Iran's own military commanders? What cannot be denied is this. The coup of 1953 became the blueprint for how covert operations would be used in the Cold War. It was a prototype of regime change, combining disinformation, bribery, and brute force. And the man who learned from it, Kermit Roosevelt Jr., later boasted that it had been easier than he expected, almost like playing with a set of toy soldiers. What he did not understand was that the soldiers of 1953 cast long shadows, shadows that would stretch into the hostage crisis of 1979, into decades of mistrust, into wars and sanctions, and into a geopolitical rivalry that shows no sign of ending. And that is, the night Mossadegh fell, the Shah returned, and the people of Iran saw their will overturned, not by ballot or bullet, but by the hidden hand of espionage. But the story does not end there, because what followed was a reshaping of Iran's politics, the consolidation of Western control, and a growing undercurrent of resistance that no intelligence agency could fully suppress. And in those undercurrents, the seeds of revolution were already being sown. In the days after Mossadegh's overthrow, Tehran was a city both subdued and seething. Tanks still rolled through its streets, the scent of smoke lingered in the air, and soldiers kept watch over neighborhoods once filled with chants of support for the nationalist leader. The Shah, timid and unsure only a week earlier, returned to the capital now as the restored monarch. To his supporters, this was a triumph, proof that the divine order of monarchy had been preserved. But to many others, the sight of the young ruler, smiling beside generals whose loyalty had been purchased by foreign gold, carried the sting of betrayal. The CIA and MI6 considered the coup a masterstroke. Kermit Roosevelt Jr. sent word back to Washington that Operation Ajax had secured victory, praising the bravery of Iranian officers and the decisiveness of the Shah. In London, Winston Churchill's government exhaled with relief. The oil fields of Iran, once lost, would soon return under Western control. But what the architects of this operation celebrated in private memos and champagne toasts was viewed very differently by Iranians, who had lived through the chaos. For them, Mossadegh had not fallen because of his people's will. He had fallen because of a secret war. Yet this war was not fought on the battlefield. It was waged in bazaars, mosques, newspapers, and barracks. The CIA's success relied on weaving together a tapestry of alliances inside Iran, exploiting rivalries and divisions that were already there. Roosevelt funneled money to local strongmen who could mobilize mobs. Clerics who feared Mossadegh's secular leanings were courted with promises that the Shah would protect Islam. Editors of major newspapers were bribed to publish daily attacks on Mossadegh, portraying him as a dangerous radical who would lead the country into chaos. These stories filled the minds of ordinary Iranians, creating an atmosphere of distrust and fear. It was a textbook psychological operation, one that blurred the line between truth and fiction until no one was sure which was which. Behind closed doors, however, not everyone in Iran's elite was convinced that restoring the Shah was the best course. Some officers who had initially supported the coup expressed unease, recognizing how deeply foreign powers had interfered. But by then, it was too late. The momentum had shifted, Mossadegh's supporters were scattered, and the Shah's loyalists controlled the levers of force. Those who questioned the outcome risked their careers, or worse. Mossadegh's trial became a public spectacle. Once admired across the Middle East as a defender of independence, he was now paraded as a criminal. Courtrooms were packed with officials loyal to the Shah, their verdict predetermined. The charge was treason, but what hung in the air was something deeper: the punishment of defiance. Mossadegh defended himself with dignity, insisting that he had acted for Iran's sovereignty, not against it. His words, delivered with frail but unshaken conviction, resonated beyond the courtroom. Yet they could not alter the outcome. He was sentenced not to death, perhaps to avoid turning him into a martyr, but to confinement in his village home. There, under guard, he lived out the rest of his days, aging quietly as the Shah consolidated his throne. The coup was followed almost immediately by a reorganization of Iran's oil industry. A consortium was formed that brought American companies into the fold alongside the British. Washington had not merely supported London. It had ensured that U.S. oil interests would now share in Iran's resources. The irony was bitter. A nationalist effort to secure Iran's wealth for Iranians had ended with even greater Western control than before. The embargo was lifted, but the profits once again flowed abroad. At the same time, the Shah tightened his grip. With CIA and MI6 advisors close at hand, he restructured his security services, eventually creating SAVAK, the notorious secret police trained with American and Israeli assistance. SAVAK would become infamous for its surveillance, censorship, and torture, a shadow that hung over Iranian life for decades. For many Iranians, this was the true legacy of 1953. Not just the loss of Mossadegh, but the birth of a state apparatus designed to crush dissent before it could rise. Yet repression could not erase memory. In homes and whispers, the story of Mossadegh's fall circulated. Parents told their children of the leader who had stood up to empire. Clerics who had cooperated with the coup later faced criticism from their own followers, accused of selling out for power. Students debated whether Iran could ever truly be independent. while the Shah owed his throne to foreign powers. These undercurrents simmered, invisible to the Western intelligence agencies that congratulated themselves on a job well done. Outside Iran, the coup sent shockwaves. In the Arab world, it confirmed suspicions that Western powers would never allow genuine independence in the Middle East. Leaders in Cairo, Damascus, and Baghdad studied what had happened in Tehran and drew their own lessons. Nationalization of resources, they realized, would invite foreign plots. For anti-colonial movements across Asia and Africa. The message was clear. The Cold War's promises of freedom and democracy could be smothered in the name of stability. Even among some American diplomats, doubts began to surface. A few quietly warned that though Operation Ajax had succeeded in the short term, it had planted seeds of deep resentment. Iran, they predicted, would not forget. But those voices were drowned out by the triumphalism of the moment. For Washington and London, this was proof that covert action could work, that a determined intelligence operation could topple governments and reshape regions without the cost of open war. And yet, within Iran, cracks were already forming. The Shah, though emboldened by foreign backing, remained deeply insecure. He knew how fragile his legitimacy was, how reliant he had become on the very powers his people distrusted. His court was filled with advisors who urged modernization, but always under a structure that preserved his dominance. Reform was allowed only when it did not threaten the throne. Opposition was crushed ruthlessly, breeding more resentment underground. The clerical establishment, too, underwent a transformation. Many religious leaders had sided with the coup, seeing Mossadegh's secularism as a danger. But in the years that followed, as the Shah's regime became more repressive and aligned with Western powers, clerics once again found themselves as the voice of discontent. This tension would grow quietly, feeding a movement that decades later would explode into revolution. Perhaps the most haunting irony of all was that Mossadegh's warnings came true. In his trial, he had insisted that foreign interference in Iran's politics would only destabilize the country in the long run. His words were dismissed by judges and generals in 1953, but history would vindicate him. The coup created not stability, but a cycle of repression and rebellion, trust and betrayal that defined Iran's future. For the CIA, Operation Ajax became a template. Within years, similar methods were used in Guatemala, Congo, and elsewhere. Each operation carried the same mixture of propaganda, bribery, and covert violence. Each was justified as necessary to contain communism. And each left behind scars in the nations where they were carried out. Iran was only the beginning, but it was perhaps the most consequential. By the late 1950s, Iran seemed quiet on the surface. Oil revenues flowed again. The Shah's image appeared on posters and coins, and foreign dignitaries praised him as a modernizer. But beneath that calm resentment was hardening into something permanent. Ordinary Iranians knew that their elected leader had been crushed by foreign powers, and they knew their new ruler owed his crown to those same powers. That knowledge could not be erased by censorship or fear. It lingered like embers under ash, waiting for the right wind to ignite. And that wind would come, not in 1953, but decades later, when the memory of Mossad merged with new grievances, and when Iran would rise again, not to restore democracy, but to demand revolution. By the mid-1950s, Iran seemed outwardly stable. The Shah appeared firmly on his throne, emboldened by Western support and the crushing of his most dangerous political rival. Two foreign diplomats and businessmen who visited Tehran. The city sparkled with new boulevards, Western-style cafes, and ambitious development plans. Oil money was beginning to flow back into state coffers, and the Shah projected the image of a modern monarch steering his country toward prosperity. But beneath this carefully polished surface, the legacy of the 1953 coup festered like a wound that refused to heal. The coup had shattered the fragile trust between rulers and ruled. Iranians had watched their democratic choice overturned not through election or civil debate, but by foreign intrigue and paid-off generals. Mossadegh supporters did not vanish. They were silenced. And silence, imposed through force, has a way of turning dissent into something deeper, more corrosive. The Shah's reliance on foreign backing made him appear less like a sovereign ruler and more like a client of Washington and London. He knew this perception haunted him, and he compensated with displays of grandeur. Military parades filled the streets, his portraits were plastered on walls, and elaborate ceremonies reminded Iranians of his divine role as king. Yet the louder the propaganda, the less convincing it seemed to those who remembered how easily he had fled Tehran before Kermit Roosevelt's machinations restored him. To maintain control, the Shah built a new security apparatus with the guidance of the CIA and MI6, but with an additional partner, Israeli intelligence. Mossad, eager to strengthen ties with Tehran as a counterweight against Arab nationalism, provided training and expertise that helped shape SAVAK, the Shah's feared secret police. SAVAK's reach extended everywhere: universities, workplaces, mosques, even family gatherings. Informants reported conversations, dissent was ruthlessly punished, and torture chambers instilled a climate of fear. For the United States, this was reassurance. Iran was now a strong anti-communist ally on the Soviet Union's southern border. American presidents praised the Shah, showered him with military aid, and welcomed him as a bulwark of stability in a volatile region. British officials, though wary of his ambitions, were content to see oil once again flowing to Western markets. To outsiders, the coup looked like a success story. Inside Iran, however, it looked like subjugation. Farmers in the countryside still struggled. Industrial workers saw little benefit from the oil boom, and students were increasingly politicized. The Tudeh party, though crushed in 1953, survived underground, feeding on anger at the Shah's repression. Nationalist groups, though leaderless without Mossadegh, kept his memory alive as a symbol of dignity. And in the mosques, clerics who had once sided with the coup against Mossadegh began to turn against the Shah's excesses, alarmed by his growing westernization and disregard for traditional values. The 1960s brought attempts at reform. Under pressure from Washington, which feared that Iran's widening inequality might trigger unrest, the Shah launched what he called the White Revolution. It was a program of land reform, women's suffrage, and modernization designed to present him as a progressive ruler. In official speeches, he claimed this was a peaceful revolution from above, intended to save Iran from violent revolution from below. For a brief moment, it seemed as though these reforms might bolster his legitimacy. But the White Revolution only deepened divisions. Land reform displaced small farmers who lacked resources to survive on their own. Urban migration surged, creating sprawling slums on the outskirts of Tehran. Traditional clerics opposed women's suffrage and other social reforms, arguing they undermined Islamic values. The Shah dismissed them as backward, but his contempt alienated one of the few institutions that still commanded popular respect. Among the clerics, one figure began to rise in prominence: Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Initially a relatively obscure scholar, Khomeini emerged as a fierce critic of the Shah in the early 1960s. He denounced the White Revolution as a foreign-imposed program designed to strengthen American influence. His fiery sermons accused the Shah of betraying Iran's independence, echoing the very grievances that Mossadegh had embodied a decade earlier. For Khomeini, the 1953 coup was not just history. It was proof that the Shah was nothing more than a puppet of imperial powers. The Shah responded with repression. Khomeini was arrested, demonstrations erupted, and blood was spilled in the streets of Qom and other cities. The message was clear: dissent would not be tolerated. Yet repression only magnified Khomeini's stature. When he was exiled, first to Turkey and later to Iraq, his sermons were smuggled into Iran on cassette tapes, spreading through bazaars and universities. The seeds of the 1979 revolution were already being planted. Watered by the memory of 1953, the universities became another flashpoint. Students, often the children of those who had celebrated Mossadegh, grew restless under SAVAK surveillance. Many turned to underground political groups, some Marxist, others nationalist, all united in their opposition to the Shah's regime. Demonstrations were met with tear gas and bullets, but the anger did not dissipate. It spread, quietly but steadily, across the country. Meanwhile, the Shah's ties with Washington grew ever closer. U.S. presidents from Kennedy to Nixon treated him as a vital ally. Nixon, in particular, gave him unprecedented leeway, selling Iran billions of dollars in advanced weaponry and supporting his ambition to make Iran the dominant power in the Persian Gulf. With oil prices soaring in the 1970s, the Shah embarked on lavish projects: skyscrapers, highways, celebrations of ancient Persian kings. He proclaimed Iran on the verge of becoming a global power. But the more he boasted of progress, the more ordinary Iranians saw the gap between rich and poor widening. Corruption flourished. Fortunes were amassed by those close to the royal court, while inflation eroded the incomes of ordinary families. The oil wealth that should have transformed Iran into a model of prosperity seemed instead to feed extravagance. And through it all, SAV's shadow ensured that open criticism remained deadly. Foreign intelligence agencies, particularly the CIA and Mossad, continued to advise the Shah, convinced that their ally was secure. They looked at the statistics: rising oil revenues, expanding military might, and concluded that Iran was stable. What they failed to grasp was that beneath the surface, anger was hardening into rage. In the bazaars, whispers of Mossadegh resurfaced. Old men told young apprentices of the nationalist leader who had dared to stand against the British and Americans. In student circles, Mossadegh's name was invoked as a reminder that Iran had once tasted self-rule, however briefly. And in Khomeini's sermons, broadcast on tapes that traveled hand to hand, the coup was invoked as the original sin that had corrupted Iran's destiny. By the mid-1970s, the Shah's regime looked powerful but brittle. It was a palace built on shaky foundations. The foreign powers that had installed him in 1953 still celebrated him as a reliable ally. But they had created a ruler who ruled through fear, not legitimacy. And legitimacy, once destroyed, cannot easily be rebuilt. The irony was stark. The CIA and MI6 had overthrown Mossadegh to prevent Iran from slipping into instability. Yet their coup had created a regime so dependent on repression and foreign backing that instability became inevitable. Every arrest, every act of torture, every extravagant celebration only deepened the divide between ruler and ruled. And as that divide widened, the memory of 1953 became not weaker, but sharper. In Tehran's cafes and student dormitories, the question began to surface again. How long could this last? How long could a ruler who owed his crown to foreign intervention truly withstand the anger of his own people? The West, intoxicated by its Cold War victory in 1953, had sown the seeds of a storm it would one day struggle to contain. That storm was not yet here, but its rumblings could be heard in protests, in whispered stories, in sermons carried across borders. And when it broke, it would transform Iran and the Middle East in ways far beyond what the architects of Operation Ajax had ever imagined. The Shah's glittering image reached its zenith in the mid-1970s. Oil prices soared after the 1973 embargo, and Iran, sitting on one of the world's largest reserves, suddenly found itself awash with petrodollars. The Shah declared that his nation would leapfrog into the ranks of advanced countries within a generation. Towering skyscrapers reshaped Tehran's skyline. Western corporations scrambled to invest. Lavish palaces, extravagant banquets, and ambitious military procurements broadcast the image of a monarch, steering his country toward modernity and power. But beneath this dazzling display of progress, the old fractures deepened. The sudden influx of oil wealth magnified inequalities instead of erasing them. The aristocracy and those with connections to the royal court accumulated vast fortunes, while urban workers and rural families bore the brunt of rising inflation. Imported goods flooded the markets, undermining local industries. The Shah boasted of industrial growth, but it was fueled by dependency on Western expertise and capital. For many Iranians, the modernization he celebrated felt alien, imposed, and disconnected from their lives. The Shah's personality increasingly shaped the state. He had been restored to power in 1953 with CIA cash and British intrigue, and that fact haunted him. To mask his dependence, he leaned into grandiose titles and ceremonies. He styled himself as the heir to Cyrus the Great, the embodiment of 2,500 years of Persian monarchy. In 1971, at Persepolis, he staged one of the most opulent celebrations in modern history. Heads of state dined on imported delicacies under massive tents, while Iranian peasants, struggling in poverty, were kept miles away. The foreign press mocked it as excess. Inside Iran, it fueled the perception that their monarch was detached from his people and beholden to foreign validation. Meanwhile, SAVAK's presence loomed over everyday life. Established with CIA and Mossad support, the organization had grown into a sprawling network of informants and enforcers. Torture, disappearances, and surveillance became routine. Families whispered at home, afraid even the walls had ears. Students, intellectuals, clerics, and labor organizers bore the brunt of its brutality. While the regime portrayed itself as modern and progressive, the reality was one of suffocating repression. To Iranians, SAVAK was the embodiment of the Shah's illegitimacy, a symbol of foreign-backed tyranny. It was against this backdrop that Ayatollah Khomeini's voice grew louder, even from exile. His sermons, recorded on smuggled cassette tapes, spread like wildfire in bazaars, mosques, and university dormitories. His message was simple but potent. The Shah was a traitor to Islam and a puppet of imperial powers. Each tape carried echoes of 1953, the betrayal of Mossadegh, the foreign-engineered coup, the subjugation of Iran's independence. Khomeini presented himself as the antidote to this humiliation, a leader who had restored dignity by reclaiming sovereignty and rooting governance in Islamic values. The Shah dismissed Khomeini as a relic of the past, but he underestimated the depth of the grievances that animated his movement. For ordinary Iranians, the memory of Mossadegh and the coup remained unresolved. Khomeini's rhetoric channeled those memories, connecting them with the lived experience of repression and inequality under the Shah. His exile did not weaken him, it sanctified him. From abroad, he appeared untouchable, while those who spoke his words inside Iran became martyrs. By the mid-1970s, the regime's contradictions were untenable. On one hand, Iran seemed like a rising power, courted by both East and West. On the other, anger simmered in the streets, mosques, and campuses. Demonstrations grew in frequency and scale, fueled by economic discontent and political suffocation. Each crackdown only intensified the resistance. Blood spilled became fuel for a narrative of sacrifice and justice. In Washington, intelligence assessments grew uneasy. Reports filtered in about growing unrest, but policymakers, blinded by Cold War priorities, dismissed the danger. The Shah was their ally, a pillar of anti-communism, a man with the region's most advanced military. He had been stable for decades. Why should that change? It was the same mistake made in 1953, only in reverse. Overconfidence and control, blindness to legitimacy. The tipping point came in 1978. A state-run newspaper published a defamatory article attacking Khomeini, accusing him of treachery and moral corruption. Far from discrediting him, the article ignited outrage. Protests erupted in Qom, leading to a brutal crackdown that left scores dead. 40 days later, in accordance with Shia mourning traditions, more protests followed. The cycle repeated. Protests, repression, mourning, and renewed protests. What began as isolated uprisings cascaded into a nationwide movement. By autumn, millions were in the streets. Strikes paralyzed oil fields, shutting down the lifeblood of the economy. Tehran's bazaar, long a barometer of political mood, turned against the Shah. The alliance between clerics, students, workers, and merchants became unbreakable. Each faction drew strength from the others, united by a single demand: the Shah must go. The Shah's once mighty security apparatus faltered. SAVAK's brutality could not extinguish protests of this scale. Soldiers began to hesitate, some even joining the crowds. The monarch, who had once declared himself untouchable, now appeared isolated, a prisoner of his palace. The grandeur of Persepolis, the billions in oil, the weapons bought from Washington, all of it seemed meaningless against the tidal wave of popular rage. In January 1979, the unthinkable happened. The Shah, who had ruled for more than 3 decades with Western backing, fled Iran. His departure marked not just the end of his reign, but the collapse of the entire order constructed in 1953. Weeks later, Khomeini returned from exile to a rapturous welcome, greeted not as an exile, but as a savior. The monarchy was abolished, and the Islamic Republic was born. For Iranians, it was a moment of triumph and catharsis. But it was also the beginning of new struggles. The revolution unleashed a torrent of energy that reshaped the Middle East, realigned alliances, and reignited the Cold War in new ways. Yet at its core, the revolution was inseparable from the legacy of 1953. The coup had planted the seeds of mistrust, repression, and illegitimacy that bloomed into revolution a quarter-century later. For the United States and Britain, the irony was bitter. Operation Ajax had been designed to prevent instability, secure oil, and keep Iran aligned with the West. In the short term, it worked. But in the long term, it backfired catastrophically. By toppling Mossadegh, they had destroyed a fledgling democracy and replaced it with a regime that ruled through fear. That regime, in turn, collapsed in fire, birthing a state defined by anti-Western ideology. The lessons of 1953 echoed far beyond Iran. Across the Middle East, people saw proof that foreign powers would crush independence to protect their interests. Leaders from Cairo to Damascus invoked Mossadegh's name as a warning and an inspiration. For Washington and London, the coup became a ghost, haunting every intervention that followed. Each time they backed a client regime, each time they prioritized short-term stability over legitimacy, they repeated the logic of 1953. And for Iranians, the memory endured. Mossadegh became a symbol not merely of what was lost, but of what might have been, a sovereign path free from the manipulation of outside powers. His portrait, banned during the Shah's reign, resurfaced in protests decades later. In the collective memory of Iran, 1953 was not history, it was a scar. In the end, the coup was not just an episode of espionage. It was the opening chapter of a struggle that defined Iran's modern history, a struggle between independence and intervention, democracy and dictatorship, legitimacy and force. It showed how a single act of subterfuge could topple a government, but could never erase the will of a people. The Shah's empire crumbled. Khomeini's revolution rose. Now the world was forced to reckon with the long shadow of 1953. What had been conceived, as a secret operation in smoke-filled rooms of London, Langley, and Tel Aviv became a turning point that reshaped the destiny of a nation and altered the balance of the world. And as history would show, Iran was never truly defeated. Its people, time and again, reclaimed their voice, proving that no coup, no matter how sophisticated, could silence the demand for dignity forever.